All right. Well, Jeremy, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Just so you can see a little bit of our faces here, we've got another introductory slide for you. And just to give you a little bit of background about what Amber and I do on our day-to-day. So, through our work with our item banks and assessment vendors, we spend a lot of our day thinking about assessment best practices and how to help you guys, our LEAs across the state, with your local assessment program. So, some of this work, or all of this work actually, is a result of that work with you guys and through the partnerships that we have with you. And we are excited to bring you some of these insights today to hopefully help you with your local TIA system. So our objectives for today are to help think through, especially for those of you who are newer to TIA or who are working on your plans over the next year or so, to think through what are some of the pros and cons of a pre and post assessment, so a BOI and EOI for student growth in TIA. We also want you to think about whether you're in TIA or not, or utilizing pre and post assessments. When you're designing an assessment blueprint, what are some of those key things that you should consider, those elements that will help that blueprint and therefore that assessment to be effective and successful? And then think through those strategies for those assessment frameworks and how you can develop them yourself, or maybe some resources that we've curated at Region 10 that can help you. So those are our outcomes for today. Let's get started. When thinking about pre and post tests, there are some absolute pros and cons to that you would want to consider, and things that you'll want to decisions that you'll want to make when determining whether this, or maybe an SLO or portfolio, is the right fit for you in your TIA system. But before we analyze those pros and cons too carefully, I want to take just a second to get on my soapbox. And if you've done a session with me before, I tend to do this for just a moment. But I think it's really important to think through some best practices around pre-assessments and how those might affect your students. So let's look at that, and then we'll come back to these pros and cons. This is just a little preview. So we've got some research here, and we'll make sure that the links for these slides and get to you guys. But just a quick note and some research about some important considerations around pre-assessments. So when we are talking about a beginning of year assessment where student learning really hasn't taken place, right? If you are following kind of the TIA guidelines, these are in the first 9 weeks of a school year. Obviously, a majority of your TEKS, your standards, have not been taught yet. And so exposing students to assessment items in that way requires some important considerations. Firstly, um, it can feel very defeating for students to be assessed on something they technically haven't been taught yet. So, how might an educator, whether that's the teacher, an administrator, a school district leader, how can we be sure to mitigate that feeling for students before the assessment even begins, right? So, being really careful to assure students and teachers what the purpose of these results are, and openly communicating that to students, right? Your results from this assessment do not reflect a deficiency on the student's part or the teacher's part when looking at the data, right? This is truly just a beginning of year assessment to determine a benchmark for where students are for the end of the school year. That transparency with both teachers and students, in my opinion, is critically important for the success of these assessments and of your TIA program. So that's number one. Number two, these BOIs, these pre-assessments, can provide really important information to your teachers. So the results should not be just isolated for use for TIA purposes or for student growth measurement purposes, and therefore reside only with an administrator or not looked at again with the teacher. These well-designed pre-assessments can offer your teachers crucial insights on what students are experiencing, what experiences they bring to your classroom, and how you can customize your future instruction based on these assessments. No, you should not design interventions based on these assessments because the students haven't actually been taught the material yet, right? So I just think it's really important to consider the purpose of the data, what the data can actually provide the teacher in the classroom, the data that it can be provided to the student, depending on their age and ability to ingest that data. But I just think it's really important to think about that as you start to implement these in your school districts before they're handed out, right? Or before we really even consider what they look like, but to think about these best practices. And hopefully those are all things that you're already doing and you've already considered. But if not, this research I found to be super valuable when thinking through this process. So I'm gonna get off my soapbox now, back away from what Courtney thinks you should or should not do, and back to those decisions that you need to make around pre and post test. So why might a pre and post test be beneficial to you? What are some pros and cons? Let's talk about the benefits first, right? Firstly, they are pretty simple to establish a baseline for student achievement. So as we mentioned, it's fairly objective, especially when compared to an SLO or portfolio. This process, the assessment process, is a little bit easier to manage and sustain a lot of times because you already have your local assessment practices in place, right? So you're already using Eduphoria for your assessment system, for your benchmarks, your local formative and summative assessments. And so just simply adding in or substituting some of those at the beginning of your assessment can feel very natural and easy to fit into your processes that you already have in place. But what are some considerations that you might need to think about when you're like, ooh, easy button, pre and post tests, right? Number one, they can be extreme. These assessments can be very difficult to create, not only because of the significant expertise that you must have in a subject matter area to be able to write these assessment items, but it can be expensive as well. So, the money is always a factor here to who are you going to hire to write these things for you. It can, if you have open response items on your assessments, obviously you're going to need to do some calibration there. Many of our STAR tests now have open response items, whether short constructed or extended constructed response. So what are those rubrics going to look like? What's your calibration and grading system going to look like? So that's something to think about. And then obviously there are some complications around test security and the maintenance of contents and standards. So maintaining these tests year over year and keeping them secure and those kinds of things can be difficult. So important considerations for your TIA kind of committee to consider when adopting this plan. So let's say, though, you've decided that those pros outweigh the cons, that you are going to move in this direction. How then do you get started with these blueprints, right? That are kind of the first step in the assessment process. We at Region 10 have been working diligently on our TEKSready assessments, who are designed specifically to help support TIA with beginning of year and end of year assessments. And these are the things that we considered key elements for our blueprint. So priority and supporting standards. The very first thing we did when developing our blueprints was to sit down and say, of these 3,000 social studies standards, I'm being hyperbolic, obviously, but of the many, many readiness and supporting standards, we cannot assess them all in a viable way. So how will we determine which of these are priority and which of these are more supporting? And your assessment teams may already have done some of this work. Your curriculum teams may have done some of this work. You might have YAGs and all kinds of curriculum documents, but pulling all of that in and saying, okay, which standards for sure need to be on this assessment? And then what item types might best actually support these standards? And what is an appropriate weight overall on a blueprint for kind of multiple choice versus other item types? Do you even want to have those short constructed and extended constructed responses that we've already talked about at all involved? Will there be other of those kind of tech enhanced item types? Are those the same across all content areas? Are some content areas more heavily weighted with various item types than just multiple choice? So all important considerations. And then okay, I have an item type, I have a standard, but what depth of knowledge? So that's kind of where we have hung our hat on these assessments. What depth of knowledge is appropriate for these? And what should a beginning of year assessment's depth of knowledge look like in comparison to an end of year's depth of knowledge? And how can we help students show us what they've learned at the beginning of year, or the tools that they bring in their toolbox at the beginning of the year, with maybe some lower depth of knowledge questions versus what are we going to do at the end of the year to truly show mastery of standards and growth from that beginning of year assessment. So I jokingly like to refer to my old assessment proverb, obviously been around for centuries, that the better the blueprint, the better the assessment. So the more time and energy you spend here determining these standards, determining item types and depth of knowledge landscapes for your assessments, the better the data is going to return for you, and the more buy-in I think you'll have with your teachers. And so it can sound daunting and overwhelming to go through these kind of next strategies for how to develop each of these key elements, but though in the end, the work is well worth the results. So Amber is going to take over now and kind of talk through these strategies and how you can make this kind of daunting task a little bit more manageable and systematic.
All right. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so like Jeremy said at the beginning, which I appreciate the bio saying 20 years. For some reason, that seems less cardiac arresting than when somebody says something like 2 decades. But Courtney and I really have had the pleasure of spending a lot of time in the assessment world and talking about assessment practices and researching assessment practices and listening to stakeholders out there as they're trying to go through this journey of creating assessment frameworks, whether that is for something like TIA, where you're measuring student growth over the course of a year, or whether that's just using good practices for curriculum-based assessments and things like that. So like Courtney said, we want to talk to you just a little bit about some strategies for creating assessment frameworks, specifically for the purposes of creating a pre and post test in this scenario. But you can absolutely apply a lot of these strategies in just good assessment practices and design for a lot of your other ones when you're talking about, unit tests or anything that you're kind of creating standards-based assessments. Many of these strategies will still apply as well. So we're going to take you through 4 today. Courtney mentioned, really the first step in creating an assessment framework is identifying those standards. You simply cannot test them all, whether you're doing a unit test or a pre and post test that's meant to measure sort of mastery across an entire year's worth of content. So you really are going to have to prioritize and determine which of the standards are going to be important enough to put on an assessment, and in what ways are we going to need to assess that to measure mastery. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how to create a skill progression. That's going to be really important as you're kind of trying to decide how we might differentiate a pre-test and a post-test. So, Courtney mentioned, obviously, there's some considerations in coming into a pre-test. We want to get a good sense of a baseline of kids, but maybe we don't want to create an item that's at the highest level of complexity and rigor that they are going to have at the end of the year, because it's unreasonable and we may not get the right kind of data that we need for that baseline. So we want to think about a skill progression, and that's going to give us a sense of where to start and where we're going. Then we're going to look at those items, those item types. what kinds of items are going to give us the very best data that we want to collect on students. Is that going to be a multiple choice? Is that going to be one of these, tech enhanced items or an open response or things like that? All of those considerations need to be determined before we put together this test. And then finally, that depth of knowledge. So setting that depth of knowledge, having conversations about, where in the understanding of these particular skills or content pieces students would want to be at on a pre-test versus a post-test, and just having some good conversations about that. So let's dig into, oops, why did that go backwards? There we go. Identifying the standards. So for those of you that have been in the assessment world in Texas for a while, this may actually look familiar. We used to do this all the time, especially as we were transitioning maybe through our various state assessments, whether, that's TOS to TAKS or TAKS to SCAR. A lot of it goes back to how do you know what kids are supposed to know and be able to do? And that directly goes back to the standard. So any conversation about assessment has to include a conversation about standards. Which ones are we going to assess? What pieces of that standard are we going to assess? Because as you guys know, in Texas, just because it's a single standard does not mean it measures a single thing. It could have lots of different pieces of content. It could have various skills that are embedded within a single standard. So the first part of this is just a conversation around which standards are we going to select. You cannot assess them all and get the kinds of data that you're really going to need to measure student mastery pre and post. So you do kind of have to prioritize those standards and determine of the standards in this course, which of these would I feel comfortable saying that a student has developed some level of mastery or some growth across this content just by measuring on these standards. And so like Courtney said, we've got a couple of articles and things linked in here that we'll work with our Eduphoria partners and try to make sure that you guys have those tagged as well. But there are a couple of things that we want to think about when we're identifying the standards that could be the highest leverage and most focus that we want to put. And you'll see them over on the left. So the first thing is endurance. How much of that particular standard endures across the entire course or across an entire subject area, right? So which of these standards are really critical for students to sort of understand fundamental things in that particular grade level or course itself, but also vertically, right? So if a student was able to do this one standard, is that going to help them with some enduring understandings in that topic or that content area, right? And so you can kind of see I've used a sixth grade science example. And we've looked at that and said, as a science expert, really understanding things like energy and position and speed, those are kinds of really fundamental and enduring understandings in a larger picture of students' scientific literacy, especially when it comes to sort of those physical sciences like chemistry and physics and things like that, right? So that's super important to think about is that going to be helpful for us, right? Long term, is that important enough, essentially? So the second thing we might want to think about here is what we call leverage. And that's a little bit different than endurance because we're sort of thinking in leverage. Can I leverage this standard or this thinking or this understanding that kids might be getting on this particular standard in another area? So, for example, can this particular standard be helpful in RLA or in math or in social studies or in some other content area as well? So if a student were able to master that particular standard, is that going to be leveraged in another area and help them be successful in some of their other coursework, right? So if you look at my example here, things like calculations, graphing, describing changes in speed and things like that, those are extremely helpful concepts that if students mastered in science, they would also be able to leverage that, say, in math, right? It's incredibly important for algebraic thinking and some of those things, and just that computational skill to be able to calculate and measure and graph and things like that. So those would be things that might be important because they're standards that we can leverage across different courses. Then we want to think about readiness. So if I'm looking vertically, right, which one of these standards is going to be key for students to be ready for the next grade level, or potentially, a couple of grade levels from now? I know not every course is completely, or course sequence is completely linear. But is it going to provide some sort of readiness for another standard that comes later on in their course sequence, right? So again, back to my science example, if you don't understand changes in position, then when you get to 8th grade, you won't be ready for this content later on, right? And so that is something to really think about is, again, and sometimes endurance and readiness overlap a lot. You can see in my example, something that endures in science a lot of times is also readiness. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? And then STAR requirements, right? We want to go back and look at which of these standards might actually be tested on a state assessment at some point, right? That could indicate to us importance. If it's part of the STAR blueprint, then obviously the state has selected that as a standard that kind of meets some of these criteria as well. And you can see the ones that are underlined there. And then finally, the last one that I've got boxed in that orange is also about student needs. And this is where you kind of have to make some decisions about your local requirements and your local curriculum and your history and your data and things like that, and say, we have said that we believe in, XISD, that if a student is able to calculate average speed using distance and time measurements, that we are extremely comfortable and confident that that student is going to be successful in where we want them to be, as our district has defined success in school, right? And so sometimes it's a local decision to say, in this district or at this campus, we believe this standard is incredibly important to their ability to get a job in our community, or their ability to go on to post-secondary success. And we're having conversations with our, college and career readiness types of conversations to make sure that kids can do these things. And so sometimes you have to make some determinations on your blueprints about which of these standards is important to us locally, right? One important note to make, and I just want to call this out because if there are any science folks on here, I believe these are old standards from before the revisions happened. So it is very possible that these are actually not current and up-to-date science standards. I just realized that. We actually created this at the beginning, sort of the TIA journey. So I apologize if it is, but the essential of identifying the standards process is exactly the same, right? We're just going to go through these, and then as I look across that, the more of these little codes that we see next to a particular standard, the more likely that I'm going to be wanting to put that on my actual blueprint, right? So if it gets a star and a check and a green circle, and I've got a box around it and it's underlined, man, I'm going to make sure I want to put that standard on a particular assessment, because that's going to help me develop understanding of a student's mastery across the entire course. So then after that, after we have narrowed that entire, year's worth of TEKS that's supposed to be mastered into a subset of those priority standards, the next piece of that is to create that skill progression, which means really unpacking that standard. I know that's a term that we, spend a lot of time probably doing in public education in Texas, but really until we understand the standard and we understand how students would develop mastery of these standards, it's incredibly hard to make an assessment blueprint, right? And determine what kinds of questions to put on that assessment, because I need to know, where would a student start? What are the foundational pieces of that? And where would they end? So when I'm thinking about pre and post test, and I want to get some good baseline activity, what would be a early entry to understanding of that standard, and where would I be at the end, right? So that's kind of what this slide is articulating here, which is we've got to look at the content and the process standards, looking at the skills, really picking that apart. So explaining how the sun and ocean interact in the water cycle. That's a very broad standard. So what does that actually mean if a student could explain how the sun and the ocean interact in the water cycle? Well, number one, could they just define the processes of the water cycle, right? So if you look over on the right side of the slide, I'm starting at the very bottom with just, do you have some, vocabulary around water cycle? Do you know what evaporation is and condensation? Then the next piece of proficiency for that standard might be I could draw and label a simple diagram of the water cycle, right? Nowhere in that standard in 5.8b over there does it say draw and label, but in order to explain in a scientific way, we know that students would need to be able to do that. Then I want to talk about the role of the sun specifically. How can I describe the role of the sun? Can a student articulate that? Can a student describe how water changes across that? Okay, can I list those interactions, explain how the sun and ocean interact, and finally, maybe analyze various representations of the water cycle to do all of those, right? So you can sort of see on the right-hand side, I'm putting together some building blocks of how students actually develop mastery on a particular standard all the way across. And the way that we can create these skill progressions is through some, vertical alignment analysis. So going back and looking at those prior grade levels and saying, okay, do we have standards in fourth grade, third grade, second, all the way down to kinder that are foundational to this? Is define processes in the water cycle an earlier grade level? If so, great. That's already defined for us in the TEKS. Sometimes it's not. It's sort of assumed. Does it say draw and label anywhere? Right? If not, we know that's part of the standard, even if it's not articulated in our vertical alignment. So you can use your district vertical alignment documents as a great resource here. You can use, like I said, vertical alignments of the standards themselves. But a lot of this just comes from, teacher experience, educator experience, your, curriculum specialists, talking about what does this standard actually mean. Right. And then the next piece of that is how do I determine where I'm going to put this on the pre and post tests, right? Because to Courtney's point, we don't want to necessarily put the highest level of mastery at the EOI at the very beginning of the year. That could be extremely defeating to students. It also is not going to get you the best data that's going to help you sort of parse out what your kids know and don't know, right? So imagine if I took a fourth grader and I gave them a calculus question. Well, they would all miss it because they have no expectation. But is that really giving me any data to suss out what they do know? Wouldn't it be better if maybe I built my BOY with some more reasonable expectations of what maybe they could do, or maybe they can't do, and that's okay too. But you at least maybe have a better chance of getting a spectrum of where students' performance is at a BOY level if you consider some of these foundational skills and early on pieces of the standard. And then to the end of the year, what they would be expected to do. So I'm going to call a timeout really quickly here because I know one of the questions we get a lot, and I know Jeremy's monitoring the Q&A, and so I'm sure we'll have a point here in a minute where we talk about questions. But one of the things that comes up a lot when Courtney and I talk about this is, well, shouldn't we have the exact level of rigor, or maybe even the same question on the pre and post test so that we can really accurately measure growth? And the answer to that is you can do both, right? If you really dig into pre and post assessment measures, if you kind of want to really nerd out on psychometrics and things like that, there's actually ways that you can do pre and post test using exactly the same question, and that gets you a certain amount of data, and you can look at that. But there's also downsides, right? Which means they've been exposed to that item once before. There's some considerations, or you can do sort of like these parallel items where it's maybe like a little bit of a clone, or you can actually do differentiated where one is slightly, different in its complexity than the other one on the post test is. all of those actually still give you information about student growth. So it really is kind of up to your discretion whether you decide to go with a exact copy of pre and post test. That is one strategy. All of these have pros and cons. So just kind of consider that as well, that there are a lot of, even within pre and post test, there are lots of different ways to do pre and post test. So we're just providing you some of the basics today, but you could probably spend an entire semester in grad school learning about all kinds of assessment measures. So then following your decision about which parts of the learning progression for a particular standard maybe fit on which test and which pieces you want to make sure that you assess, the next thing to really do is determine that item type, right? Which is how are you going to gather the data on that beginning of year versus the end of the year? And are there particular item types that you could use that might be better to collect the kinds of data that you're going to want to be able to analyze. So Courtney's already talked a little bit about some of the things like constructed response or things that might need calibration. You also want to think about kids' familiarity with these item types, right? So many of you guys do your local assessment in Eduphoria already, but depending on the grade level, something like kindergarten, obviously, starting out with some of these item types might, at the beginning of the year, might be something that you want to caution against because they've never been introduced to online testing at all, versus at the end of the year after they've had some practice. So all of those things would be considerations in determining your item types. Beyond that, you want to think about which is the kind of question that's going to actually fit with the learning progression that I just determined. So if it says something like categorize, do I have item types on here that help me categorize? Something like a drag and drop, perhaps. Something, like a match table grid maybe is a better categorization than, constructed response, right? Where I'm explaining or things like that. Or maybe they're both acceptable. So kind of thinking about and being really, really strategic about what is the question that best aligns with the kind of data that I want to collect based on the knowledge and skills I'm assessing on that standard, but also what kinds of data am I going to be able to analyze and then determine growth over time, and what does that look like on the grading, for lack of a better word, right? So obviously we need to have a score in order to do TIA, and we need to measure that growth. So is it going to be reasonable for you to be able to quickly get student data and be able to get that score that you can then compare when they do their EOY, right? So those are the kinds of considerations. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So you can see this particular question has to do with density. Can y'all tell I was a science teacher? I like to use science examples. Don't try to get me talking RLA or anything like that. I'll get hives. But we can use a multiple choice question to be able to assess students' foundational understanding about, floating. Is it, do they know density perhaps? But they also have that structured choice, right? So there's an element of guessing that's going to happen in here, especially something like a BOY, right? So we may be able to have kids that get it right, but don't actually know. So that's a consideration. Here's another example of a same concept where assessing students' understanding of density. In this one, I've got a multi-select, so a little bit more complex question, right? So I have to know all of the ways in which these answers are correct or incorrect, not just one single one. So it takes a little bit of that where I can just click a button and get a right answer through chance. You do have to, get more than one of these correct. So that helps you kind of suss out whether the students really have a depth of understanding that's a little bit different. So that's one. And then finally, here's another way that we could assess the concept of density with a completely open-ended short constructed response, having them analyze a table of density information and being able to write an explanation. So as you're thinking about building these blueprints and building these tests, you might consider what would it look like if I used, multiple choice on a BOY? And then at the end of the year, I did something like this constructed response, right? And would even a student who, got the first one right and got the second one right, would they have some measure of growth, right? Would I be able to say that that student grew in their understanding of that? So really being thoughtful is the key here about which item types, what standards, when in the process, whether you're doing a BOY or an EOY. And like I said earlier, this is not just for the purposes of pre and post test for TIA. This is a strategy that I would apply to all assessment creation. And the amazing thing about the tool that you guys work with is that you've got so many options for being able to design item types in Eduphoria, being able to use your item bank resources and assessment content that's out there. So you have lots and lots of options, but we really want to be thoughtful as we apply all of those options. So then the final kind of piece of this then is really thinking about that depth of knowledge and saying, how would I make sure that a student is growing in their understanding of this content? And sometimes we're able to do that because we can measure. Okay, so at the beginning of the year, they had some ability to do some recall types of things, right? Maybe they could give me a label or they could list some examples or something like that. And then all the way towards the end of the year now, they can actually compare and do some of that more complex thinking. They could, really differentiate between this example and this example as opposed to just listing some examples, right? And so you see over here on the right, you can kind of see the same concept, but at different depths of knowledge, right? Describe the parts of the life cycle of the butterfly. Describe the difference between two different life cycles, right? That really make sure that you understand life cycles and kind of do that similarities and differences. And then DOK level 3, that strategic thinking. Now I'm asking you to take your really deep understanding and create something that represents that, which really takes you out of something that you've just learned and forces you to now take knowledge and apply it in a new and novel situation, which is that strategic thinking. And so it's all measuring the same understanding of the standard, but at different complexities, right? That depth of knowledge that you have to create a model is substantially different than just listing and describing the parts of the life cycle. So that is something, again, that you also want to consider as you're building these BOYs and EOYs. Is it appropriate to ask kids at the beginning of, fourth grade to describe a model that you might use to represent the relationships of a life cycle when you're not even 100% sure they know what a life cycle is, right? So that may not be an appropriate question to put on a BOY, but it certainly could as an end of year assessment item. So I'm going to pause right here. I think this is a good place to pause and see, Jeremy, if we have any questions or anything, and then I'll let Courtney talk a little bit about what's on the screen after we've had a chance to do Q&A, and if there's anything that I need to address or Courtney does.
We haven't had any questions pop up as of yet. So if we want to take just a half a second, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop it into the chat or into the Q&A.
It's a quiet group today. I think it's because Amber's done such a fantastic job of making the super complicated feel easy, or maybe
Yes.
less
I,
hard.
I feel like
Yeah.
that's exactly true. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Courtney. I always love to say if there are no questions, it must be because I'm such a great teacher. Either
That's
that
right.
or you guys, ran to the fridge to get a snack or something, and just aren't at your computers.
Well, we're still clear right now, and I'll ask for questions one more time as I close it out here in just a little bit.
Yeah, we're gonna wrap up here in just a minute. So, um, the if this feels difficult, there's a child psychologist that I love to follow, and she says it feels hard because it is hard, right? So, I hope that you um, don't give up on the process and know that there's some resources out there to help you. So, um, I have great news for you today, which is that um, if there are beginning of year and end of year assessments that you're looking for, or at least the blueprints that you're looking for, these are available on our TEKSready website. So if you go to teksready.com, all of the blueprints that Region 10 has created for our assessments in the TEKSready program are freely available to you to use. Whether or not you subscribe or use our assessments or our items, you can absolutely use our blueprints. So we've done hopefully some of the difficult work for you, or at least giving you a starting point.
We've
So what?
had one question pop
Oh,
in.
yep, absolutely.
Roxanne, she's asking, when using TEKSready, what's the best way to test K1 and 2 students at the beginning of the year? Do you recommend smaller chunks, paper, other
Yeah,
methodologies?
that's a great question, Roxanne. What we've talked about in some of our user group meetings, I don't claim to be, an K1 expert. I do have a kindergartner at home, and so I have that experience. And he's actually taken some of our TEKS Ready assessments as a great little, quality assurance here. What districts are telling me that they are doing with their assessments is yes, to break them up into pieces. And Eduphoria makes that really easy inside of Aware. We have some help documents that can help you navigate how to kind of chunk these assessments inside of Aware. But also, I would suggest, if possible, administering these in smaller groups rather than in a whole class. Like, um, someday, I hope we can get these assessments to a point where, a student may be able to independently, a kinder, first, second grader may be able to independently, and from kinder to second grade, their um, ability, their reading ability, right, and their ability to work independently and use, iPads or whatever it is that they're using, obviously grows tremendously, even just in kindergarten from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. But especially at the beginning of years, in these lower grade levels, working with the little learners, I would suggest smaller groups and some teacher assistance there, just as the TEKS would suggest, right? So how much that is and what those chunks look like is up to your district, obviously, and kind of the resources that you have available. But those would be my suggestions. Um, but I do, just want to finish my thought here around these TEKS Ready blueprints. The assessments, we hope, if you subscribe to them in Eduphoria, can help get you 90% of the work. We know how difficult these assessments are to write. It's difficult just to even write the blueprint, and so much more so to write the entire assessment. So we hope that these can be a resource to you, that they can get you uh, uh, 90%, of the way there, and then you just have these local decisions to make, right, around things like short constructed response and item count and percentage of tech enhanced items. You have a starting point for which to customize. Making a single assessments for an entire state is a really difficult task, as I'm sure you can imagine. And so we want to provide really great resources to you, and provide support in thinking through and being thought partners with you and consultation with you along these assessments. But there are obviously still some local decisions that have to be made around these and what fits your scope and sequence, what fits your assessment, current assessment program. And so let us help. Please ask questions. Reach out to us, and we would love to be thought partners with you as we continue to refine these and get these to be really great resources for you. So that's a little bit about TEKSready, and then I think we just have our contact information and how you can reach out to us. So there's our pictures again. And we would love for you to reach out to us. There's the website there again. If you didn't get it earlier in the chat, I posted the bit.ly for this presentation. It is case sensitive, so those are all capital letters. So you can have these resources. You can utilize the slide deck however you wish. Take it and make it your own. hopefully it's helpful to you, and reach out to Amber or I if you have any questions or would like to talk about these resources or this process anymore. We would love to do that. As we mentioned in our bios, this is really what we love about our job is getting to work with you guys. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any more questions, or Amber is, if there are any.
Awesome. And if y'all wouldn't mind, I'll start presenting again. Let me pick the right screen here. All right. Leave the door open one more time for any final questions. Feel free to drop them into the chat or into the Q&A. I do have one question for you, Courtney and Amber. What if I'm a district on the call or watching this video here in a little while, then I don't have TEKSready? Well, how would you recommend we get in touch with someone to get a hold and purchase TEKSready?
Absolutely. So, sales at edgeaphoria.net is always a great place to start. The Edgeaphoria team is so responsive and helpful in being able to get you trials to view our questions and content, and get you a quote so that you kind of know what to expect. And if you have content questions, then that info@teksready.com email address is how you can get in touch with my team to answer any questions about the content. And those are two really great resources. You can always reach out personally to myself as well. And then the part of the beauty of these assessments is not just the assessments themselves and the items and what you can utilize to create your own local assessments, but how it can fit into how easy Edgeaphoria and Aware makes the TIA process, right? So hopefully you're already utilizing some of the great resources and have been a part of some of the TIA webinars that the Edgeaphoria team does. They do such a great job of being a support system for our TIA districts. And hopefully this is just one more piece of that puzzle to support you. And so reaching out to the Edgeaphoria team or myself and my team at Region 10, we can absolutely get you pointed in the right direction.
Awesome. All right, I don't see any other questions coming in. So if you have any after the fact, after the presentations ended, feel free to reach out at training@edgeaphoria.net or reach out to the Region 10 team, and we'd be happy to answer any questions as they occur.